The future holds tremendous promise for scientific research and breakthroughs. AI and other technologies could be truly transformative. But at the same time, dramatic cuts in federal funding and mass layoffs are putting that progress in jeopardy. Dr. Francis Collins helmed the National Institutes of Health for 12 years before he left altogether last March. I can't think of a better person to help us understand the government's role in scientific research and the impact the decline in federal support may have, from cracking the code for various diseases to drug development to a scientific brain drain. Dr. Francis Collins, thank you so much for talking with us.
Please call me Francis, and Katie, it's great to be with you. I'm a great admirer of all that you have done to tell the world about important and accurate information. So thanks for doing this.
Well, I try, so thank you for saying that, Francis. First, can you explain in layman's terms the role the U.S. government plays in medical research and how federal funding is critical to that research?
I'd be glad to, and I'm not sure that's something everybody understands, so good to be able to have a chance to lay this out. Ever since World War II, following the very important report by Vannevar Bush, the model was put forward that for various areas of science, and certainly including medical research, the greatest way for the United States to succeed is to create what we now call an ecosystem between basic science funding, which isn't necessarily attached to a particular disease or a particular product, but is sort of fundamental discoveries that are going to undergird everything. And that's something the government can support by basically putting grants out there that universities can compete for, because that's where a lot of the scientific talent is in the universities. But then we count on, as those discoveries happen, something looks like it might be heading towards a new treatment or a prevention for cancer or diabetes. Then companies get engaged because they can see there's a pathway there to a product and a profit. And that's the way the whole system has worked over the course now of many decades. And it has turned the United States into the unquestioned leader in biomedical research and productivity, and something that the rest of the world has greatly admired and oftentimes tried to emulate or even copy. And it is, of course, also the source of a lot of jobs for people in universities who do this research. The federal government support for biomedical research primarily goes through the National Institutes of Health, which is not a household word, maybe, but maybe it should be. With its current budget of about $48 billion a year, 85% of that goes out to those universities. And how do they get the money? Investigators working in those places come up with a really compelling idea, and they send that to NIH with a proposal about what they need to get the work done. And that gets reviewed by a rigorous panel of peers who know the science really well. And because the funds are limited, only about 1 out of 5 of those grants actually gets funded. Then they get the funds and they are given 3 to 5 years to go and do something amazing. And that has been incredibly successful up until now, but maybe we're going to talk about this. It's all under a lot of stress right now.
Yeah, we are going to talk about it, but just to clarify, it sounds as if the NIH is primarily, Francis, a clearinghouse where grants are given, proposals, scientific proposals are heard before a team of experts. Does the NIH do some actual research itself?
Yes, I'm glad you asked. So about 10 or 11% of the budget goes to what's called the Intramural program. And that's about 5,000 doctoral level scientists who run research labs and also are coordinating their efforts with the largest research hospital in the world, which is the NIH Clinical Center, located in Bethesda, Maryland. Patients come to that clinical center for whom medical practice really does not have a solution, and they're there oftentimes with a sense that this is their last hope of finding an answer. And those clinical trials that go on in the clinical center are everything from cancer to rare genetic diseases to mental health challenges, you name it. And that has been the place where an awful lot of major advances have happened clinically, including such things as the first development of chemotherapy for leukemia, and more recently, cures for sickle cell disease, and a whole lot of other things in between. So that is also a really critical part of the NIH portfolio of activities, but it's somewhat different than the grants program, which goes out to all those universities across the country. But importantly, when you hear about a breakthrough in medical research that ends up on the front page, maybe even above the fold, it's highly likely, if it was a US investigation, that it was funded by NIH. But people may not realize that. They think, oh, that university paid for it. Well, no, the university provided the resources in terms of buildings and lab space, but the funds for the research for such things as cancer or diabetes or heart disease or a rare genetic disease almost certainly came from NIH.
That's so interesting because I've read that a lot of the labs and the infrastructure for the research is paid by the government. But you're saying that the researchers themselves and the support, I mean, can you help me understand that, Francis? Because I'm a little confused.
It's a really good question, especially right now, because there has been some confusion about this. So, if I'm an investigator at a university and I got a great idea, I'm going to write a grant proposal that puts into the budget salary for people in my lab, for part of my research salary as well, and some supplies and equipment. But recognize I can't do any of this work unless the university provides me with lab space. They pay the bills for the electricity. They provide a library where I can get access to journals. They take care of such things as if I'm running something involving animals, that there's an animal facility and there's a review group to make sure the animal research is being done ethically. So there's all that other infrastructure that's necessary for research to go on. If universities had to cover all of that themselves without any help from the government, they basically get out of the business because it costs a lot of money and they don't have that. So the way in which this has worked over many decades is the federal government also pays what is unfortunately called indirect costs, which sounds like a slush fund, but it's not. It's basically to cover those additional university costs without which they really couldn't afford to do the research at all, for the utilities, for the lab space, for the building maintenance, for the library, all those things. That is negotiated in a very rigorous audit between each university and the government to decide what is a fair amount of dollars for that so-called indirect cost rate to be decided. And then that gets applied. So if the indirect cost rate is 50%, which is a fairly average number, and the grant is for $100,000, then the university actually gets $150,000. So they can actually cover all of the costs or most of the costs and not have to go into the red.
Having said that, it must be frustrating for you. I know it is for me as someone who cares deeply about cancer research, that only 1 in 5 promising research proposals is actually funded by the government.
It is frustrating, Katie. And since I had the privilege of serving as the NIH director for 12 years under 3 presidents, this was something I was constantly looking at, trying to figure out, could we do better than that? Because I know if you're only funding 1 out of 5, you're leaving some really good science on the table that you just can't afford. Ideally, we ought to have more budget than this to be able to fund more. And let me give another reason why that's a smart investment. It turns out that every dollar that NIH gives out in a grant to some investigator somewhere returns $2.46 of that investment within a year. That's recent data from last year. So there's a real economic benefit to everything that NIH is doing. So people have made the case, various economists, and that if we really want to make the most of that, the NIH budget ought to go up so that we could capture more of that benefit and we could fund more people to do great research. It is frustrating, particularly if you're a young investigator just getting started and you've got a great idea, but you only got 1 chance out of 5. Now, you'll want to be in that 1 out of 5 by putting forward the boldest, most creative idea. But we have a lot of those. And so many times investigators get frustrated, have to try again, come up with another idea. And I'm afraid we make investigators spend an awful lot of their time writing grants instead of doing the research once they have the research funds.
Let's talk about why the system is under stress, as you said. You were head of the NIH, Francis, during the first Trump administration, but this time it seems as if things are very different. Can you compare the two terms?
They are very different. During the first Trump administration, there were a number of proposals made that would have had pretty significant effects on research, including cutting that indirect cost rate that we were just talking about. But those were put forward, they were debated, they were discussed, the consequences were considered. And for the most part, any really drastic changes were seen not to be a good idea, that they would do more harm than good. And so NIH flourished pretty well during that first Trump administration. Keep in mind that the way in which NIH gets resources are more due to the Congress than they are due to the executive branch. The old statement is that the president proposes a budget, but then the Congress disposes and decides what they think the right answer is. And for many years, going back to about 2015, the NIH was strongly supported in a bipartisan way by both houses of the Congress, and were able to see a budget each year that grew a little bit, about inflation plus a couple of percent, because of strong leadership from both parties, particularly in the Senate, but also in the House. That was a wonderful phase to be in, because with that, you could increase the likelihood of somebody getting a grant funded. And you could also start new, bold ideas like the BRAIN initiative, for instance, that would be hard to do if the budget was really tight. And that all sustained itself pretty well during the first Trump administration. And then, of course, COVID came along in 2020, and everything got very intensely distressed at that point. And I lived through that period in ways I'll never forget. But we managed, and I will say, maybe we'll come back to this, what NIH was able to do with the development of those mRNA vaccines will be seen by history as one of the most amazing scientific achievements ever. The second Trump administration, which started January 20th, came in with a whole lot of other ideas and applied them really almost immediately in a flood of executive orders and other decisions that were coming from HHS, many of which have really been quite stressful on the whole biomedical research effort, involving cutting jobs, sometimes in a way that felt pretty indiscriminate in terms of which jobs were cut, and cutting budget situations in a way that also slowed things down, and also put in various kinds of controls of the grants process that have slowed down the ability to review new grants and have resulted in the termination of grants that were already underway. So altogether, it's been a pretty chaotic and difficult time.
Let me read some stats for you, if I could, Francis. So far, the Trump administration has ordered $2.7 billion in funding cuts, the elimination of 1,200 jobs, which has resulted in the termination of nearly 800 research projects for the NIH. But in addition to that, as you explained, the grant process and how most of the budget goes to research universities, Johns Hopkins lost at least $800 million in federal grants, prompting the institution to terminate 2,000 members of the staff. Cornell, meanwhile, lost $1 billion. So, as you can see, it's been, as you know, it's been a bloodbath, not only at the NIH itself, but at all these institutions. So, what is the impact of all these cuts? Not only the funding, but also the loss of jobs.
It's been very significant. There's no precedent for this kind of really dramatic set of changes in such a short period of time. I've been at NIH for 32 years, or I was until March 1st, and I've been through transitions between administrations, and there were always some bumpy periods there as the new team coming to town had their ideas about things they wanted to change, but nothing that even comes close to this approach. As part of the effort to cut the government workforce, the numbers that you mentioned, 1,200 people basically at NIH being set loose. And even before that, there was a basically effort to let all the people go who had been at NIH less than a year. That was 1,165 people that got an email on Valentine's Day to say their services were no longer needed. That was particularly hard because those were the people who had just arrived, many of them with new ideas and new technologies. They were going to be a lot of the future promise of the institution. And without any individual considerations about their contributions, they were let go. That was very hard to see. And yes, in terms of the grants program, it's particularly hard to see the 800 grants that you mentioned that were already funded, and some of these already underway for a year or two, being terminated in mid-course, so that the work that was underway is potentially lost. Some of those even involve clinical trials that had patients that were signed up involved in a trial that might mean they were being tested on an experimental drug or a device, and then being left in the middle of that without any clear indication about what had been learned or how they were going to be taken care of. That sort of thing is unprecedented. I think in the past, NIH might have, in a given year, found it necessary to terminate a half dozen grants for the entire enterprise, usually because of an investigator who died or there was some other really serious problem with the project. But now to have this happen to some 800 grants across many different areas, although particularly targeted in things like DEI, is really sending quite a difficult message to people trying to do this work. I'm particularly worried, Katie, about young investigators who are looking at this situation and wondering about stability for themselves and what kind of career path does this mean they're going to be able to pursue with their dreams. Many of the graduate students that I know that I've spoken to are really wondering if it's going to be necessary for them to pursue a career in medical research in another country, because they're not sure with this circumstance that they're going to have the support they need to go forward. That's really troubling. We could lose a whole generation this way. We could have a brain drain going the other way when we've been so fortunate in the US to have an environment that allowed a lot of people to come to our shores, work in our labs, many of them become citizens and stay here and become leaders. If we turn that around the other way, that's going to have profound effects going forward.
Obviously devastating for the institutions, for the scientists, young and old, but also, Francis, for the patients. We're talking about people out there who are participating in clinical trials, perhaps to save their own lives or to help save other lives in the future. I mean, these are people and these are real world implications.
Absolutely. And I'm glad we're going to talk about that. That's the most important part of this conversation. Medical research is a wonderful detective story to find answers and figure out how life works. But the real point of it is to help people, to prevent disease, to alleviate suffering, to cure things that currently we can't cure. And we're on this amazing historical moment where those kinds of advances are happening at a pace not really previously seen. Certainly things happening in the last couple of years that I didn't think would happen in my own lifetime. The ability in some instances to cure people with stage 4 cancer using the immune system to go after those cancer cells, your own immune system, just wake it up and put it to work. Or curing a genetic disease like sickle cell disease, or seeing cystic fibrosis, a disease that I worked on way back when I was a beginning out investigator at the University of Michigan, where now, thanks to this ecosystem doing its thing between basic science and clinical work, most people with cystic fibrosis can now plan for retirement instead of an early death. These are just remarkable advances, and yet they are all now at risk. And so patients are the people we should be most listening to, and there's lots of them beginning to raise their voices, wondering why this is an acceptable path for our country to take. I saw certainly at the NIH Clinical Center, one of the places where cancer immunotherapy has been making some of the most dramatic international strides because of all these constraints about budgets and staffing. Trials for people who have stage 4 cancer have been significantly slowed down. They don't have time for this. Every month matters if you're waiting for that particular protocol to get started. And yet some of that is now happening. So I just hope that word is getting out there to the American people, because this may all seem a little obscure. And when people hear, well, they're just cutting the number of people in the government, that's probably good. It's probably bloated. Let me tell you, as NIH director for 12 years, I know the place. I know the people who are there. They're incredibly dedicated, devoted. There is not a lot of extra time for anybody there not to be doing their job. It is a very intense experience. And to have the circumstance now of losing as many as 20% of the staff is just having significant consequences on the ability to go forward. And that in turn is slowing down life-saving research.
I know very well what you mean, that many of these patients don't have a month to spare. You know, having lost my husband to colon cancer over just a 9-month period. But Francis, you talk about this inflection point with solutions or like immunotherapy that, you know, are saving lives now and could save more lives in the future. We have more targeted therapy, ways of figuring out sort of the biology of diseases, but we're also at an inflection point because of artificial intelligence. And that has the potential to put some of this progress on steroids if you have the funds. But cutting these funds is pretty much cutting off the opportunity to unlock the mystery of many of these diseases with the power of AI.
You're totally right, Katie. And AI is all the buzz in lots of settings, and people are, I think, primarily considering it in other areas like cars that don't have human drivers or things that are happening in the tech world. But in medicine, AI is got this incredible promise, and much of it's already being realized. Take, for instance, the ability to use AI for images like x-rays that in the past had to be read by radiologists in a dark room who maybe got a little tired and missed something. The AI version of this turns out to be, in many instances, more accurate, more reliable. It doesn't get tired in the middle of the night. Similarly, AI can do things with electronic health records to make sense out of information that just we humans digging through may miss, and figure out, for instance, when a particular patient in a hospital has had a turn that means you really got to look and see quickly what's happening before there is a crisis. All of those things are becoming quite real, but they require experts, and the experts require stability in their job, of course, and they need to be in a circumstance where there's staff surrounding them who have the knowledge about the medicine and the other things that are important for pursuing one of these projects. And right now, because of all these changes and the staff reductions, there is a great deal of concern about the teams doing this, about whether they're going to be able to go forward in the way that they would like to. Frankly, people are really demoralized. They're just not sure how to move forward in this situation. It does feel like in some ways there's been some targeting of scientists, as if, particularly if they're federal scientists, that they're part of the problem, instead of thinking about these as folks who are giving their life to public service, trying to find answers, and many of them accepting financial support that is far less than they could get in the private sector. But it's what they want to do, and they're determined to do it. And to have them now treated this way and dismissed without an explanation in some instances, or considered as if they're sort of part of an obstacle instead of part of an answer, that's very hard to watch.
And also in some of the, records, taking out references to diversity or to women or to, any terms that actually help us understand how diseases affect different people and different races and different biologies seems so silly.
Well, I understand the administration feels strongly that the focus on DEI got out of control, but the way in which that's being interpreted does spill over into areas that really are central to our understanding of medicine. We have to accept the fact that, at least in the United States, health disparities are a real circumstance that needs attention. Why should your zip code be such a prominent predictor of your longevity? But it is. And a lot of that is based upon socioeconomic status and other environmental circumstances, but they affect different groups in different ways. So we need to study health disparities. And in order to do so, we need to understand all kinds of diversity of our population So to take D out of this particular set of ideas that we want to pursue doesn't work. In my own field of genomics, we're particularly interested in how DNA reflects your ancestry. And we know we're all part of one family that arose maybe 150,000 years ago, coming out of Africa. We're all Africans originally. But to understand that genomic diversity is critical for figuring out ways to do a better job of preventing disease and understanding how differences between our inheritance may make a difference in whether we respond to a particular drug or not. That's like really cutting edge, hot science, but it's diversity. It's genomic diversity. We want to do more of that, not less.
It seems like a massive overcorrection that really will stymie some science and our understanding of different groups, not only just economic disparities, Francis, but also how disease manifests itself in different biologies and different people, right?
Yeah. Take an example, which has just sort of recently been discovered. If you go to a dialysis facility where people are there, sometimes coming in every couple of days to go through hemodialysis because their kidneys have failed. And if you look around to see who's there, you will see that there is an overrepresentation of African Americans in most dialysis units. And we used to look at that and go, well, it's because they have more hypertension and diabetes and less access to health care. So that's what's really done the problem for the kidneys. And that's partly true. But it turns out that there's a variation in a gene that in West Africa protects you against a particular illness called sleeping sickness caused by trypanosome. That variation does a great job of keeping you healthy in West Africa. But if you come to a place where sleeping sickness is not a problem, that same variation predisposes you to kidney trouble and ultimately, in many instances, to this end-stage renal disease. And those people end up in the dialysis units, and they are mostly African Americans. We didn't know that until we started studying genetic diversity. And now that we know that, there's actually an effort to develop a specific drug that will work for that kind of kidney failure that we would have never had the chance to try. The drug's starting to look pretty promising without doing this research. Just that one example tells you if we really want to make progress for everybody, we have to study everybody, and that means studying the diversity of the human population.
That is a great example. Meanwhile, I know with the recent cuts to federal health teams, critical data on issues like cancer rates among firefighters or first responders, HIV treatment, even drug-resistant infections are no longer being collected. As Politico notes, the cuts have also stymied work on issues President Donald Trump has personally championed, including halting HIV transmission and improving access to IVF. What are the risks of not collecting this data? It seems moronic to me, Francis.
We can't make good decisions about healthcare unless we have the data, knowing where the problems are and whether they're getting better or worse. I think this is another example, Katie, where an effort to try to trim the workforce very quickly without taking the time to look at the consequences has had a lot of unfortunate, unintended consequences that are really hamstringing the effort in many ways. One hopes that there will be some effort to recognize the inadvertent harms, at least I think they're inadvertent harms that have been done, and then try to fix it. But this is medical care and this is medical research. It's not like a Silicon Valley startup where maybe you can make some mistakes and then just put it all back together next week and it'll be fine. Well, I guess the Silicon Valley motto is move fast and break things. That seems to be what's being applied here. But for something that involves human lives and well-being, I think we'd be better off to stick with first, do no harm. And I'm afraid that's not been applied very effectively, and a lot of harms have been done.
With the significant cuts that we've seen affecting USAID, Francis, are you concerned about the global impact those cuts will have on diseases all over the world, not to mention the U.S. standing in the world?
I'm somebody who's had a lifelong interest in global health. I think the whole planet is something we need to think about, even if we're going to be focused on ourselves. What's going on the rest of the world gets to us really quickly. We saw that with COVID. We saw that almost with Ebola. So if you really are serious about health, you have to be concerned about the rest of the world. USAID was a central part of how the United States reached out to countries with less resources to help them with terrible diseases like HIV, like tuberculosis, like malaria. Won us a lot of friends in that regard. Put in place the kind of surveillance to be able to detect something going awry with some new emerging disease that we would really want to get on top of very quickly. To have all of those resources basically zeroed out was a shock, coming so quickly after the new administration arrived. And I think has caused a lot of countries to wonder about who they thought they were going to depend on to be sort of a soft power neighbor, and now doesn't seem to be so interested in that anymore. NIH is the largest supporter of research in global health in the world, or we have been, even more than the Gates Foundation. And yet that is also very much now at risk. I think even if it's just for self-preservation, we need to be involved in global health efforts. But more than that, I think most of us have somewhere deep down a desire to try to help those who are less fortunate. That's part of how we're put together. That's part of our moral compass. And to step away from that and basically to say that's not our problem anymore doesn't quite feel like the kind of America that I thought we were. And I do hope that as some more serious consideration goes to the consequences here, that some of that outreach can be preserved. Look at the PEPFAR program started by Republican President George W. Bush, which is estimated to have saved now 26 million lives that otherwise would have been lost to HIV/AIDS. That too now under jeopardy because of the cuts. With the consequences, some people have said as many 2 million people may die in the next 12 months because of the changes that have been made since January 20th. I don't see how anybody could look at that situation or those numbers and feel like, well, that's okay. It's not okay. Those are real human lives, many of them children. I think we do have an obligation to think carefully about what our role needs to be going forward. And this doesn't seem like it's on the right track.
I want to ask you a couple of quick questions about measles, because we're currently experiencing a measles outbreak that has resulted in the deaths of 2 children and 712 cases in 24 states and climbing, unfortunately. Last week, Health and Human Services Secretary RFK Jr., who has a well-documented history of vaccine skepticism, offered qualified support of the MMR vaccine, stating that, quote, people should get the measles vaccine, but the government should not mandate those. What is your response to not only that statement, but his history of vaccine skepticism and how he has handled this measles outbreak from the beginning?
Well, I'd prefer not to go into any specific comments about any particular leaders. Let me just say the story about measles is this is an incredibly important illness worldwide. People don't realize that last year more than 100,000 died of measles worldwide, most of them children. This is not a disease to take lightly. And yet we have what many people would say probably the most wonderful vaccine of the whole list against measles, because it is so effective if you get 2 doses. And it, for many people, seems to be lifelong. Many vaccines, as we know, require boosters. Measles doesn't and generally do so, although it's not a bad idea if you're at high risk to make sure your immunity is still there. To have now here in the United States, this outbreak with, as you say, more than 700 cases and 2 young girls under the age of 10 losing their life to this is not something that should happen when we have this vaccine as such an effective preventive. So I would say the public health message ought to be to parents, you don't want to let your child be unprotected against a potentially lethal disease any more than you would want your child to be rolling around in the back seat of your car without being restrained in a car seat if they're at that age. This is just part of taking care of what you can do to be sure your children have the chance to live a healthy life. Unfortunately, starting a long time ago, this notion that somehow the MMR vaccine might be attached to the risk of autism has continued to reverberate in certain quarters, even though that has been resoundingly disproved by multiple studies involving tens of thousands of individuals. Let's be clear. Measles vaccine does not cause autism, period. That's been established. We don't need to keep looking at that. It's done. And yet that is still out there as a concern. And I do think it's unfortunate that there are voices that continue to cast doubt on the safety of a vaccine that otherwise can save a lot of lives. And what's happening right now really should not be happening in the United States of America.
There are lingering concerns and questions about the connection between the MMR vaccine and autism. And frankly, I think Secretary Kennedy has done very little to quell those questions and concerns. And he has announced that HHS will determine the cause of autism by September. What is your reaction to that dramatic declaration?
I was surprised by that. Certainly, autism has been a high priority for research at NIH for a couple of decades. Back when I was in charge of running the Human Genome Project and some of the projects that followed after that, there's a big focus on trying to understand what are the genetic contributions to autism. And what has not, I think, been as well appreciated as it should be is this is a diagnosis that within it probably has a very heterogeneous collection of causes. There are certainly children who have some of the more severe manifestations of autism for which one can identify significant misspellings in DNA that are the main cause in that particular individual. And then there are others with milder kinds of autistic symptoms, which may have some genetic factors, but maybe are interacting somehow with an environmental source yet to be determined. But there's a vast wealth of research that's already been done here. Unfortunately, not yet with a clear answer in most cases. I don't see how it's at all possible that in the space of 5 months, that's all going to get figured out by September. And I'm a little worried that seems to make a promise that won't be possible to deliver and may therefore give false hope to parents who are waiting for that answer. And I understand why. They want to know, why did this happen? We want to know that too, but let's attack it in a fashion that's really going to depend on what we already know and take it to the next level with some of the newer approaches that are now being tried, but they're not going to happen that quickly.
It makes you wonder too if it's a reason for parents to not get their children vaccinated while they wait for an answer to basically prove that the vaccine is safe.
That would be a terrible mistake. The vaccine is safe. We already know that. Let me just say that again. This is a solved problem. The data is there for anybody who's willing to look at it. The MMR vaccine has no connection to the onset of autism. And so we should set that one aside and parents make their decision about the vaccine based on the benefits risk calculation. And this is one where the benefits are vastly, vastly greater than the risks.
Francis, Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, who's the new director of the NIH, was a vocal critic of the government's COVID-19 response. He argued in something called the Great Barrington Declaration that COVID-19 data was skewed toward more severe cases and that healthy individuals should have been allowed to resume a normal life. I'd love to hear what you have to say, because I know you also have been somewhat self-critical of the government response and the way COVID information was communicated to the public.
I have high hopes that Dr. Bhattacharya, now that he's been at NIH for a couple of weeks, is going to be in a position to try to turn around some of the things we've been talking about that have really created a lot of chaos and distress and have slowed down the progress of science. He's a Stanford professor. He's had NIH grants himself in the past. He's a regarded economist as well as a physician. Yes, he and I have disagreed in the past about COVID management. I don't know that it's helpful to go back through those things again because we're in a different place now. But I think his opportunity now is to look around and see where the scientific initiatives are currently standing that could be benefited by a push. My own sense is that there's a lot that can be done there. And I think he's already gotten off to a good start by indicating that he wants to move forward and not back. And he's also done something that helped the investigators at NIH just in the last couple of days, which is to say the ban on traveling to scientific meetings has been lifted, because since January, none of the scientists have been able to even go and mix with their colleagues and learn something new. And fortunately, that now is going to be lifted.
Francis, I know you wrote a book called The Road to Wisdom on truth, science, faith, and trust. I know you're a person of deep faith, but I'd like to focus on this truth, science, and trust part of your book. How can we make people trust science? COVID, as a result of COVID, science took a big hit. And what do you think needs to be done to bring back the trust in science and help people understand what the truth actually is?
No, thank you for asking. And yes, this book has a lot in it on this topic, which I can only touch on for a minute. First of all, I think we do have to reclaim the principle that there is such a thing as objective truth, that facts are facts and they don't care how you feel. It seems that in our highly polarized, divided society, it's okay to say, well, that might be true for you and it's not true for me. And that's fine if it's the opinion about a movie. But if it's about a fact like HIV-AIDS is caused by a virus, then it's not okay to say, well, I don't like that one, so I'm not going to believe it. We have to reclaim that. And then I think we all have to really be more careful about our sources of what we consider to be reliable facts. Social media may not be, in many instances, the place that you can count on. You should be more discriminating in terms of looking at the source and what its credibility is, its competence, its integrity, its humility, not overclaiming what they know and what they don't know, and not be so influenced by whether the source happens to be in our own bubble or not, because that can lead you down the wrong path. If we could all figure out how to reclaim what Jonathan Rauch calls the constitution of knowledge, things that we can be confident are actually true and reliable, then I think we'd have a better shot at pulling our country out of what right now is a pretty difficult space.
Is anything giving you hope at this current moment?
Yes, it is. I will confess that I'm somebody who tries to find hope in most circumstances, and it's usually paid off. I have hope because I believe the American people fundamentally are good, honorable folks who want to be generous to their neighbors, and they want to have our world be a place that's full of peace and where love and goodness and truth and beauty, once again, are values that we can all stand on. We've gotten so distracted by all the vitriol, all of the arguments, all of the things that seem to be dividing us. But if we individually, one at a time, could start to bridge those gaps. So anybody listening to this, there's somebody you used to be friends with that now you can't talk to anymore because they're on a different side of an issue. Time to reach out. Say, hey, let's go have coffee. I want to hear why you feel the way you do. And I'm going to really listen, and I'm going to tell you what I heard you say. And we're going to figure out how to understand each other. This is the braver angels approach. You might not end up agreeing. You probably won't, but you'll understand each other. And that's really what America's always been about. We don't always agree for sure, but we don't demonize each other. We don't decide that somebody on the other side of an issue is evil. We just think, well, maybe they're a little misguided, but we can still get along. We need to do more of that.
Dr. Francis Collins, always a pleasure talking to you. Thanks for making the time for us today. I really appreciate it.
It's great talking to you, Katie. Keep putting out the word here. We're going to get through this.